I did not see Merrick again for 2 years. Then, one day the police found him. He had my card in his hand, so they brought him to the London hospital. He was very tired, hungry, and dirty, so I put him to bed in a quiet little room. But he could not stay at the hospital. He was not ill, and of course the beds in the hospital are for ill people. We have no beds for hungry people or ugly people. I told the hospital chairman, Mr. Cargom, about Merrick. He listened carefully, and then he wrote a letter to the editor of the Times newspaper. From the Times, December 4th, 1886. A letter to the editor. Dear Sir, I am writing to you about a man in our hospital. He needs your help. His name is Joseph Merrick, and he is 27 years old. He is not ill, but he cannot go out of the hospital because he is very, very ugly. Nobody likes to look at him, and some people are afraid of him. We call him the Elephant Man. 2 years ago, Merrick lived in a shop near the London hospital. For 2 pence, people could see him and laugh at him. One day Dr. Frederick Treves, a hospital doctor, saw Merrick, brought him to this hospital and looked at him carefully. Dr. Treves could not help Merrick, but he gave him his card. Then the shopkeeper, Silcock, took Merrick to Belgium. A lot of people in Belgium wanted to see him, and so after a year Merrick had pound S50. But then Silcock took Merrick's pound S50, left Merrick in Belgium and went back to London. Merrick came back to London by himself. Everyone on the train and the ship looked at him and laughed at him. In London, the police put him in prison. But then they saw Dr. Treves's card and brought Merrick to the London hospital. This man has no money, and he cannot work. His face and body are very, very ugly, so of course many people are afraid of him. But he is a very interesting man. He can read and write, and he thinks a lot. He is a good, quiet man. Sometimes he makes things with his hands and gives them to the nurses, because they are kind to him. He remembers his mother, and he has a picture of her. She was beautiful and kind, he says, but he never sees her now. She gave him to Silcock a long time ago. Can the readers of the Times help us? This man is not ill, but he needs a home. We can give him a room at the hospital, but we need some money. Please write to me at the London Hospital. Yours faithfully, F.C. Cargom, Chairman of the London Hospital. The readers of the Times are very kind people. They gave us a lot of money. After 1 week we had pound S50,000, so Merrick could live in the hospital for all his life. We could give him a home. We gave Merrick 2 rooms at the back of the hospital. 1 room was a bathroom, so he could have a bath every day. Soon his skin was much better, and there was no horrible smell. The 2nd room had a bed, table, and chairs. I visited him every day and talked to him. He loved reading and talking about books. At first he did not know many books, the Bible and 1 or 2 newspapers, that's all. But I gave him some books of love stories and he liked them very much. He read them again and again and talked about them often. For him, the men and women in these books were alive like you and me. He was very happy, but sometimes it was difficult for him. At first, 1 or 2 people in the hospital laughed at Merrick because he was ugly. Sometimes they brought their friends to look at him. One day a new nurse came to the hospital, and nobody told her about Merrick. She took his food to his room and opened the door. Then she saw him. She screamed, dropped the food on the floor, and ran out of the room. I was very angry with the nurse and went to see Merrick. He was not happy about it, but he was not very angry. I think he felt sorry for the girl. People don't like looking at me. I know that, Dr. Treves, he said. They usually laugh or scream. Well, I don't want nurses to laugh at you, Joseph, I said angrily. I want them to help you. Thank you, doctor, he said, in his strange, slow voice. But it's not important. Everyone laughs at me. I understand that. I looked at him sadly. In his one good hand, his left hand, he had the little picture of his mother. He looked at the picture for a minute, and then put it by a flower on the table. A tear ran out of his eye and down the skin of his enormous, ugly face. Dr. Treves, he said slowly, you and the nurses are very kind, and I'm very happy here. Thank you very much. But I know I can't stay here long, and I would like to live in a lighthouse after the hospital, please. A lighthouse or a home for blind people. I think those are the best places for me. What do you mean? I asked. Why? He did not look at me. He put the flower on the picture and looked at it carefully. Lighthouses have sea all round them, don't they? He said. Nobody could look at me in a lighthouse, so I would be happy there. And blind people can see nothing, so they couldn't see me, could they? But Joseph, I said, this is your home. You live here now. You aren't going to leave the hospital. Not today, perhaps, he said, but soon. You are a kind man, Dr. Treves, but I can't stay here very long. I have no money. I smiled. Joseph, I said, this is your home now. Don't you understand? You can stay here all your life. Very carefully, I told him about the letter to the Times and the money. I don't think he understood at first, so I told him again. He was very quiet for a minute. Then he stood up and walked up and down the room very quickly. A strange sound came from him, like laughing. I did not want Merrick to live by himself like a man in a lighthouse. He read his books and talked to me, but I wanted him to talk to more people. And I wanted him to talk to women. Merrick read about women in his books, but he did not often talk to women. He met the nurses every day, but they did not talk to him very much. For them, he was always a creature, not a man. One day, one of my friends, a beautiful young woman, came to the hospital. I told her about Merrick and took her to his room. She opened the door and smiled at him. Good morning, Mr. Merrick, she said. Then she shook his hand. Merrick looked at her for a minute with his mouth open. Then he sat down on his bed with his head in his hand and cried. He cried for nearly 5 minutes. The tears ran down his face, between his fingers, and onto the floor. My friend sat on the bed beside him and put her hand on his arm. She said nothing, but she smiled at him and shook his hand again before she left. Dr. Treves, he said to me that night, that lady was wonderful. My mother smiled at me once many years ago, but no women smile at me now. But this lady smiled at me too, and she shook my hand. A beautiful lady smiled at me and shook my hand. My young lady friend came again the next week and talked to Merrick for half an hour. The week after that, she came again with a friend. They gave him some books and had a cup of tea with him. It was wonderful for him. For the first time in his life, he had some friends. He was a very happy man. He sat in his room and read his books and said no more about living on a lighthouse. People began to read about Merrick in the newspapers, so he had a lot of visitors. Everybody wanted to see him. A lot of important ladies and gentlemen visited him. They smiled at him, shook his hand, and gave him books. Merrick liked talking to these people, and he began to forget about his ugly body. His visitors never laughed at him. He began to feel like a man, not a creature. One wonderful day, a very important lady came to the hospital to visit him. I met the lady and took her to his room. Then I opened the door and smiled at him. "Good morning, Joseph," I said. "There is a new visitor to see you today. A very famous lady." Merrick stood up beside his table. He did not smile because his face could not smile, but his eyes looked happy. "That's good," he said. "Who is it?" I moved away from the door, and the visitor walked in. "Your Majesty, this is Joseph Merrick," I said. "Joseph, this is Her Majesty, Queen Alexandra, the Queen of England." Queen Alexandra smiled at him. "How do you do, Mr. Merrick?" she said. "I'm very pleased to meet you." Then she shook his hand. Merrick did not move. For nearly half a minute he stood and looked at her with his mouth open. Then he spoke, in his strange, slow voice. How do you do, Your Majesty?" he said. But I don't think the Queen understood him because he tried to get down on his knees at the same time. It was very difficult for him because of his enormous legs. "No, please, Mr. Merrick, do get up," said the Queen. "I would like to talk to you. Can we sit at your table?" Yes, of course," he said. They sat at the table. She took his left hand, the good hand, in hers. She looked at the hand carefully, and then smiled at Merrick again. "I often read about you in the newspapers," she said. "You are a very interesting man, Mr. Merrick. You have a very difficult life, but people say you're happy. Is it true? Are you happy now?" "Oh, yes, Your Majesty, yes," said Merrick. "I'm a very happy man. I have a home here now and friends and my books. I'm happy every hour of the day." "What a wonderful story," she said. "I'm very pleased to hear it. Now, tell me about your reading. I see you have a lot of books here." "Oh yes, Your Majesty. I love my books," said Merrick. And for nearly half an hour they sat and talked about books. The Queen gave him a little book and some red flowers before she left. After her visit, Merrick began to sing. He could not sing easily, of course, because of his mouth, but all that day there was a strange, happy noise in his room. He looked at the flowers carefully and put them on his table. He had many visits from the Queen, and at Christmas she sent him a Christmas card. Windsor Castle, December 20th, 1888. Dear Joseph, here is a small Christmas present for you. I think it looks like me, does not it? I do visiting you very much, and I am going to come to the hospital again in the new year. Happy Christmas. Your friend, Alexandra. The present was a picture of Queen Alexandra, with her name on it. Merrick cried over it, and put it carefully by the bed in his room. Then he sat down and wrote a letter to the Queen. It was the first letter of his life. The London Hospital, December 23rd, 1888. My dear Queen, Thank you very, very much for your wonderful card and the beautiful picture. It is best thing in my room, the very best, the most beautiful thing I have. This is the first Christmas present. Perhaps I had a Christmas with my mother once, but I do not remember it. I have my mother's picture too, and she is beautiful like you. But now I know many famous ladies and kind people like you. But Dr. Treves, and I am a very happy man. I am happy too because I am going to see you in New Year. Happy Christmas to you, my dear friend. With all my love, Joseph Merrick.